Welcome to Otto's Notebook with Grace, Skyler, and Malcolm, a podcast intended to spark conversations about the mindedness of organisms and connect influential and contemporary ideas from philosophy to your experience.
And we're back.
So we've covered two explanations of mindedness, and our goal is to apply these frameworks to our street dog case to illustrate how these animals are minded. A little bit about street dogs. They're generally untrained and exist on a generous spectrum of being not sociable with humans or dogs at all, and incredibly social and eager to approach humans. They're scavengers in their search for food and shelter. Often the dogs in their pack structure have power structures, and you can see the differences in hierarchy based on how much they play with one another, who eats the most, and that's how they mark their position in the pack and as members of a group. Established groups of street dogs tend to stay in familiar territories with mutually understood limits, and some dogs spend much of their time on the street but are still owned by locals and return home in the evening.
Street dogs must learn how to meet their varying needs for food, water, shelter, and social bonds. Generally, to survive in a city, it is impractical for dogs to be alone, as they cannot cooperate to find food and share information about places to sleep. Much of their survival is determined by the behavior of the humans that live in the area that they occupy. And the dogs both shaped by the environment and act upon it such that they can more easily and reliably find food, shelter, and social patterns. We'll use the case of street dogs and their behaviors with the world and explain their mindedness from each perspective. The argument from analogy by Andrews recommends that we identify properties of animals that are similar to properties of human minds. How do the perspectives of Sterelny and Clark help us understand the mindedness of animals?
One particular remarkable behavior of street dogs is their ability to find their way home. Either a location where they rest with friends for the night, or a home where their owner resides. We'll frame the task of finding your way back home through both the embedded and extended approach.
First, the embedded perspective. One behavioral characteristic of street dogs is that once they have gained entry to a pack, they tend to stay within range of those dogs and not cross out of that territory. Skyler, tell us your story about your lost friend's dog in Mexico.
Love that. One particular story that comes to mind for me was when I went to a trip to Mexico, and we were living with one of the townspeople there, and walking through the town. There was a ton of street dogs roaming, as well as being on roofs and other street corners. In particular, like when we would walk down a particular street, some dogs would bark at a certain point, and as soon as we crossed maybe like a fence or like another block, the dogs would stop barking, and even though they saw us like maybe not that far away, also considering that sort of like territorial behavior, as well as just even the dogs roaming around, while they were super comforting in terms of people walking around, at certain times they would start barking and being really defensive. With the story of the lost dog that I was staying with, we got back home, and the dog that the owner I was living with had roamed out of the little area they had. We walked around the neighborhood, asked around where the dog went, and soon we were told of different locations, went to that location, and we turned back with no hope of finding the dog. And as soon as we came back, the dog was also finding its way back home. And we followed all the instructions of all the other locals, and when we came back, we found that dog coming back home, and we thought that dog definitely found its way back home in that sort of regard.
Yeah, that's an incredible story, and what a complex cognitive task for a dog to successfully perform. So within this embedded framework, we can understand that part of the reason that dogs are able to accomplish these complex tasks is because their cognition is embedded in the environment. So that includes varying landmarks along the way. The Andrews argument by analogy suggests that we reflect on the similarity of dogs' experiences to ours. For example, if I'm lost in a mall trying to find the parking garage, I might look at familiar landmarks, such as the GameStop or Build-A-Bear workshop that I have seen before to find my way to the exit. Our reliance on particular landmarks to find our way to a destination before is familiar to all of us. We can also see that the embeddedness of the mind in the way that dogs learn more about their environment. Dogs that have owners sometimes follow their owners to the store and in this way collaboratively explore new realms. They draw on resources unfamiliar or invisible to us, like locating themselves in a familiar social space by virtue of smell. Social spaces are generally limited by the hierarchical groups that exist in them, the hierarchical groups of dogs, which makes sense that you would have other dogs identified with a space and such determine that you're home. A fire-scented fire hydrant is a sure way to know home is nearby. Marking fire hydrants, then, is a way that dogs make useful features of the environment more salient. These fire hydrants are necessarily personalized by the dogs that mark them, who are specific to the area, so this is a collective project. If dogs' social networks only partially overlap, they then have more information about dogs they might expect to share territory with that are unfamiliar to them, or if any new dogs have passed through. Of course, fire hydrants are used or rained on quite often, so they might not be the most trustworthy. In these observations, we can see the three dimensions of functional relationships between dogs and the environment and how it is mutually shaped in order to accomplish the task of finding their way home. First, they use resources like owners who are more trustworthy and fire hydrants as reference points. If it smells like home, I should be close. The fire hydrants are a collective project that increase the salience of information related to finding home turf, and they are shaped by and help all dogs who sniff them.
Thank you, Grace, for sharing that perspective. I will go into the second perspective, which is the extended mind. On the flip side of this perspective, you have navigational ability of these dogs through interaction with the environment in which they exist in. Following the argument laid out by Andrew with the argument scheme of analogy, humans and their ability to determine where they are and how they find their way back home using interactions with the world around them. For example, when someone goes on a run, they would keep an eye out for physical signs and landmarks to build a route back to where they live, whether it be using their phone's Google Maps or seeing physical things in the world like people, smell of food, and other things along their run. Given this example and the example previously stated with the lost dog, these street dogs do the same thing, such that they use physical landmarks with street alleys, buildings, store corners, and dumpsters to identify familiar locations to go back home. With Clark's criteria, these physical landmarks are seen to incorporate the four criteria of the extended mind. The landmarks that the street dogs use are reliably available as they remain in the same location, and that when the dogs pass by them, they can determine and also feel a familiar way to get back home, and also recall that information as well as recall the route back home. Also, these physical landmarks are seen as trustworthy as the street dog could recognize where a location is most familiar with in their home turf or in their specific location where the house is, and that they were kind of like consistently used, especially when roaming around the neighborhood, when people are passing by, and even when being amongst other street dogs. Additionally, also the street dogs' use of landmarks too are also easily accessible as they pass by them along the street, and lastly get consciously endorsed over the course of their time in a particular place, such that when street dogs know and understand what areas of town are unknown to them, they turn back home and discover that this is a location that they are unfamiliar with, and thus show that there is some sort of mindedness of within street dogs.
Today, we started off with Andrews's argument from analogy, which gave us a starting off point in our journey to prove that animals are minded. Argument from analogy shows that cognitive abilities in animals that are similar to humans' shows that animals are minded. Grace then explained the 3 dimensions of embedded cognition, and then Skyler discussed the notion of the parity principle in the extended mind. Using street dogs as an example, we showed that the street dogs' ability to find their way home proves that they are minded, using Sterelny and Clark as context.
Thanks so much to tuning into our podcast, Otto's Notebook, today. We hope you enjoyed our discussion of street dogs and mindedness, and we're wishing you the very best weekend, because this podcast comes out on Fridays.